It was quite a week. I was struggling with a brutal man cold for most of the week. And just for some clarification, a man cold, does that mean that compared to children and women, a man cold is much worse? Or is it a derogatory expression, meaning that women tend to be quite resilient and carry on no matter what, and when a man gets a cold, he carries on? I feel so awful. I feel so bad. Does anybody care about me? And it's been quite a week with the spiritual journey some of us have had with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Went from the Leafs falling as good as dead at the start of the week, and then the last few days, the Leafs have rised again. It's like a hockey resurrection. So we got to believe in those Leafs. And then on Monday, I was in court. I was one of amongst about 130 lucky candidates, volunteered, summoned to be potential jury members. There were a lot of us on what's called the jury panel because they were looking for two juries of 12 to cover two cases. But early that morning, in the first case, the accused exercised his right to be tried in front of a judge only and not a jury. So that meant there was only one case requiring 12 jurists. We filled out our cards, and with our number on it, it went into a big bin, and there was what I guess is called the jury lottery. Now I thought for a moment, I addressed lotteries last week as a gray area. I wondered if I had put up my hand and said, Judge, this is a gray area. I don't believe in playing the lottery. I wonder if she would have let me out. I don't think so. Anyways, the process began, numbers selected. Some people were actually excited to be selected for jury duty. Others exercised their right to recuse, and they made their case in front of the judge, and in every case, the judge dismissed them. But we ended up with 12 jury members. My number was not selected. I was heartbroken. Yeah, right. I was greatly relieved, and especially with the severity of my cold over the last few days, I'm actually quite delighted that I wasn't selected. But what really impressed me on Monday morning was compared to other countries around the world, and there are too many countries like this, compared to other countries, Canada places great value on our rights and freedoms. And what impressed me with all the policies and procedures on Monday morning is the extent that we will go to ensure that the accused has the right to a fair trial. And we live in a country that is concerned about rights and freedoms, the rights of the accused and the rights of the victim, the rights of landlords and the rights of tenants, the right to go on strike. We've heard a lot about that over the last few days, haven't we? Or some people would say there are human rights commissions. There's commissions, agencies right here in Ontario that protect the rights and freedoms of people, especially against discrimination, unfairness, or injustice. We value rights. We demand our rights and freedoms. As I've heard over and over and over again over the last few days, there are people who will fight for their rights. We insist on rights. In fact, could I even go as far as saying I think we're obsessed with rights these days? And that was very true as well of the situation in Corinth in the first century. The people had great value when it came to their rights and freedoms. They fought for them, they demanded them, they were proud of them in terms of Greco-Roman culture at the time. They were known for that, for their freedoms and rights. Maybe that's why, with Paul's guidelines in 1 Corinthians 8, many would have viewed them as being quite controversial. We've got a lot of material to cover, and I'm hesitant to provide a brief recap, but we have to provide a recap if we're going to unlock the key to understanding Paul's intent in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. You'll recall last week that Paul looks at the issue of eating idol meat. That's a gray area that he addresses. The Corinthians had likely mentioned it in their letter to him, wanting some guideline and some direction. And Paul does that. We extended that issue to issues that we face. And as you recall, we had quite an extensive list of gray areas. Lots and lots of feedback I've received over the last few days about some of the items on that list. But Paul looks at that. Remember, we talked about a process for decision making when it comes to gray areas. I said we have to determine, is it a gray area, or has the Lord commanded, this is right, this is wrong? So if we come to a position that, it is a gray area, that we actually have the right to choose in that area, we have the freedom to choose, then we can then work towards what I called a settled conviction, making some kind of decision as to how we're going to respond to one of those gray areas. But we suggested there's a caveat. There are qualifications. It's freedom, but limited freedom given the setting, circumstances, or situations we might face. We looked at the guiding principle. The guiding principle that covers all this issue is, you remember, love surpasses knowledge. We asked the question, we want to be people who are puffed up, walking around with their chest out saying, I know my rights? Or are we going to be people committed to loving others, even if it might mean forgoing some of our rights? Which leads Paul to his particular concern in chapter 8. That is when your rights collide with the rights or preferences of what Paul calls the person with a weaker conscience. I suggested that this is someone who is vulnerable, somebody who maybe doesn't have settled conviction in some of these areas. His or her conscience is telling them, I just don't think that is right, or I think that is wrong. And in this case, we need to be sensitive to that person's conscience, because in that case, if they disregard their conscience, Paul infers that it could lead to some disastrous or damaging results. They ignore their conscience and what it's speaking in a weak area, or a gray area, and might end up actually sinning in a more significant area. So the two verses I just want to highlight again from last week, 1 Corinthians 8, verse 9, where Paul says, be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. And then Paul goes for the gusto in verse 13, where he says, therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall. So Paul here is stating a position, yet I can't help but wonder, what reaction did Paul's teaching here generate? This epistle would have been read, and maybe the person reading it would have taken a pause. Maybe there would be a moment or two for some reflection. And I wonder how some people might respond. I think some might be a little taken aback. Some people would be saying, Paul, we have fought hard for our freedom. We value our freedom. we see it as so significant. And we know our rights in these areas, especially in these gray areas. We have a clear conscience when it comes to eating this kind of meat. Just as you might say, I have a clear conscience when it comes to my kids or grandkids going out trick-or-treating on Halloween, or I have a clear conscience when it comes to drinking beer or wine here, there, or anywhere, or I have a clear conscience when it comes to anything I do on a Sunday. After all, isn't a Sunday just another day? All days are holy days. And I wonder if they were thinking that way. Some would have thought maybe, Paul, this is personal. And I have to be aware of my, not sure if they had the expression then, but sure is a big expression today, my true self. I don't want to deny my true self. How dare I be hypocritical? For me not to do that, for me to relinquish that right would be hypocritical. And I want to honor my true self. Or it's people saying, Paul, you're not being practical. You're just a tent maker. You're working off on some lowly street somewhere, repairing sails, doing a little bit of leather work, making a tent or two. But we hobnob with the higher class in society. And you know that the banquet halls where we have our civic lunches are usually attached to the temple. So the reality of eating meat there that's been offered to idols, if we're going to get far, we need to be prepared to do that. It will be bad for business if we relinquish that kind of right. And then maybe some of them just thought, Paul, you're being way too extreme here. Paul, you say that if what I eat, but have you ever experienced the harsh reality of what it is to forgo some of these rights? Well, this brings us then to chapter 9, that big chunk of scripture that Rick read for us. Two questions, or three questions. Is Paul simply defending his apostleship? Some people believe that. I believe that perhaps in a secondary way, he is arguing that he is a true apostle. I don't think that's the big issue in chapter 9. Paul will articulate that a whole lot more in 2 Corinthians. Is Paul offering guidance, some specific guideline for how we are to compensate and how we are to look after those who are pastors and missionaries? I've been on the Christian journey a long time, and I know a lot of people like to cherry pick from 1 Corinthians 9 and come up with all kinds of ideas as to what it means to support missionaries and pastors and other Christian workers. My argument today is that in the context of the passage, 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10 are one unit. And Paul has a big idea throughout chapter 8, 9, and 10. Here it is, up front, my main point, my big idea today. We need to be willing to give up rights for the sake of others out of Christian love. That's kind of the punchline of chapter 8, 9, and 10. In the Christian life, we need to be willing, at times, in some circumstances, in some situations, maybe even in some settings, to give up rights for the sake of others out of Christian love. So I've only got 3 parts to this sermon. You may need to study in more detail all the particulars of 1 Corinthians 9. I have enough material to be here this afternoon till 3 o'clock. I think most of you would like to get out on time today. So I'm just going to highlight a few things in these verses. So if we look at 1 Corinthians 9, Paul kind of sets his agenda in verse 3, where he says, This is my defense. It's like Paul says, like I was in court on Monday, Paul saying, I want to invite you into my theological ethics courtroom. And Paul says, I'm going to defend, this is my defense to those who sit on judgment of me. Got to be careful with this, but unfortunately, Paul loves using what I call the dangling this. When I was teaching at the college, marked literally thousands of papers, and I'd always be on students for what I called a dangling this. You got to modify the this. What is the this pointing to? What has come before, what's coming after? If it's just dangling, it can be confusing. I guess Paul missed that grammar class because we have the dangling this. Is Paul saying, this is my defense, pointing back to verses 1 and 2, or is he saying, this is my defense, as in what's to come? I would argue it's what's to come, as I appreciate the context, and I have a lot of smart Bible scholars who support that view. So what Paul is saying is, this is my defense. For those who question my approach, those who have a problem with this idea of relinquishing rights for the sake of others. Now, what I find brilliant about Paul, he's going to present evidence and proof, but Paul doesn't talk in chapter 9 about eating idol meat. How many times did Rick mention idol meat when he read the passage to us? No times at all. What Paul does, which is really brilliant, and scholars appreciate this, Paul uses another area, that is his right to receive financial support, comparing it with the right to eat idol meat, because though they're different areas, the same principle is going to apply, the same big idea. Remember our big idea, we need to be willing to give up rights for the sake of others out of Christian love. And Paul is going to say, I do have experience. I know what it's like in this area of financial support. And that's why I can relate it to this area of eating idol meat. So very quickly, in verse 1 to 3, Paul has to establish his apostleship. He says, I am free. I know what it is to be free. I value freedom just like you do. And I'm also an apostle. All those questions are hypothetical or rhetorical, anticipating a positive response. And then Paul is going to make this case evidence and support for this idea that he should be receiving some kind of financial or provisional compensation. Did you look at the list? You want to talk about a lot of evidence. He talks about food and drink. Don't we have a right to food and drink? He even extends it a little bit to take a wife along on a spiritual journey. This is not going to be a proof text that Paul had a wife, but Paul is using that as an example. I find it quite intriguing that he talks about the brothers of Jesus. We don't have a lot of references, do we, in the epistles to the brothers of Jesus, but obviously they were involved in mission work. Cephas, Peter, we know that he had a wife. And then he goes on and he gives some examples that are just really human, practical examples. He's talking about soldiers. When a soldier goes out to battle, he doesn't go, okay, I'm being deployed. When I pack up here, I better pack some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and 2 or 3 boxes of crackers if I want to eat. No, he's going to have that provision made for him, just as the planter of the vineyard is expected to eat some of his produce, or the shepherd, the milk or dairy product. It could include cheeses as well. Then we have that obscure reference to the ox. In this case, Paul's going back to Deuteronomy 25, where the idea here, it's kind of complicated, but the idea is you don't muzzle an ox so that the ox can't eat at all as he's doing hard work. That would be cruel. Just in the same way, it would be cruel to not allow a pastor, a missionary, to reap some of the benefits from the work they're doing. Paul goes on. He has other items on his list. He talks about others. Maybe he was thinking of Apollos. I'm prepared to say maybe Apollos was compensated for the work he did in Corinth. And then before I look at verse 12, it's like in verse 13, 14, I love this. It's almost like Paul has a P.S. I believe in the inspiration of Scripture, but I love how refreshing some of that is. So Paul's saying, oh, by the way, just to add to my case, don't forget what went on in the temples, right? The temple workers, they received provisions and compensation for the work they did. And then the zinger, of course, is in verse 14, where Paul reminds them in the same way, the Lord, that is Jesus, has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. That's a pretty strong argument that Paul's getting. Now, of course, where we wrestle with that, is this a command that's intended for those who are ministering or those who are being ministered to? It makes more sense to me that Paul may even be thinking of Jesus referring to those who are being ministered to. But I said verse 12, and verse 12 is kind of his punchline. Another punchline. He says, but we do not use this right. Now, my question is, Paul, why have you spent so much time? It's like the defense lawyer who calls not just 2 or 3 witnesses, but 50 witnesses, and they're all kind of saying the same thing. You're going, okay, enough. Or, not just 2 or 3 exhibits, he's got 50 exhibits. In football, it's called piling on. You're going like, okay, Paul, you've made your point. In fact, ironically, most of the people he's speaking to would have had no problem with the idea of Paul being fairly compensated for his work as an apostle. But for Paul, it's very important that he establishes that he knows he has rights. This isn't something where Paul is willing to relinquish something he doesn't have. It would be like a young lady phoning her boss and saying, sir, I want to let you know that I am relinquishing my right to a corner office at headquarters. And the boss says, that's a very honorable thing for you to do. But as a clerk who has been on probation for like 1 week, I'm not sure that you even have that right. You better show up tomorrow at your little cubicle. It's simple, but actually so important. You're going to go, boy, that's brilliant, John. You can't relinquish what you don't have. Okay? You can't give up something that you don't possess. So Paul wants to make it crystal clear that he gets it. He gets that he has freedoms, that he has rights, especially in this area. But here's what Paul says. We did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Paul is saying that if he has to choose between 2 things, hindering the gospel of Christ or demanding his rights to be compensated for his ministry, he will always choose to do what's necessary not to hinder the gospel, even if it means relinquishing or refusing the rights that he deserves. I find this all very intriguing. Paul, sometimes it's hard to figure out. Did Paul always refuse support? Remember back in our series in Philippians? Paul seemed to have no problem receiving support from the Philippians. But he seems to have an issue here with the Corinthians. I find that there's a couple of things. I've done some speculation. One is that given what we know about Corinth, Paul did not want to be bought. There were some strong factions, some people who would say, Paul, we'll support you. We'll give you even extra, but we expect some favors from you in terms of church life and in terms of our spiritual well-being. It's also very apparent, this comes through so clear in 2 Corinthians, that there were a lot of peddlers back then, a lot of people who were preaching and abusing the gospel only to line their own pockets. That's so foreign to us today, isn't it? And that was a big issue for Paul. Paul did not want in any way to compromise that. There were situations that Paul recognized that it was okay for support, but Paul never wanted to have people think that he was only preaching the gospel. He was only involved in Christ's work just to make a whole lot of money. I remember years ago at the Bible college, a young guy coming up to me and saying, "John, one day I want to be a pastor." I said, "That's wonderful. Why do you want to be a pastor?" He said, "Because I heard that pastors can end up being very rich." I said to him, "Okay, I think you're pursuing the wrong vocation. Pastor work can be very rewarding, but I know very few pastors who are millionaires in my scope of influence." The reality is it is a calling. It's why in verses 15 to 18, Paul gets very personal and very passionate. Paul is saying, if I can put it this way, I am compelled to preach. It's almost as if Paul is saying, it's not about being paid. I would do this whether I was paid or not. Now, some of you have been called to a vocation. I regard it as ministry too. And some of you would say, you know what, at the end of the day, I think I would do that whether I was paid or not. It's nice to be paid, nice to put a meal on the table, but I just have a passion. And that's why Paul talks about, I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I don't preach. I can't help it. I look for, and that to me is always the sign, by the way, of somebody who's called into that kind of ministry. You can't help it. You look for opportunity. You look for reasons that you have so you can fulfill that calling that God has given to you. Well, let's pause just for a moment and ask the question, so what do we pull out of this main section? Please don't forget, I do this intentionally, our big idea. The big idea is, are we willing to give up rights for the sake of others out of Christian love? Paul's saying, if giving up what is due me will promote the gospel, it's going to advance the gospel for the sake of others, and I'm doing it out of love, wonderful. If giving up idle meat is going to be for the benefit, the spiritual benefit of those who have a weak conscience, then for their sake and out of Christian love, I'm willing to do it. So the question that I often get asked about 1 Corinthians 9 is, so does it say anything about guidelines for paying pastors, maybe even more significantly missionaries, because this really has a more direct context to missions. An issue I always have with looking at Acts and the epistles is this description or is it prescription? Very critical question when it comes to what we call Bible hermeneutics. I would say that Paul is giving a description. In the description, there's some insights, but I'm not saying we just take what's written here and just superimpose it on our situation in 2023. I don't think Paul had to worry to the same extent about taxes, filling a vehicle with gas, the various housing approaches, pastors with manses, pastors with clergy resident deduction. None of those issues applied to Paul back in his day. But he does make 2 or 3 points that I think are very worthy of our consideration. One of them, and I feel awkward, but I will say it, there is no question at all in this passage that Paul agrees that pastors and missionaries should be fairly compensated. That's a non-factor. It's not up for those being ministered to say, you know what, I think this is a good idea. I think you should forgo support. I think it'd be good for you to learn to starve so that you can develop real faith in the Lord. If that's a takeaway for you, definitely as a church, as a Christian community, this is a responsibility. It's the worker who has the right to use that right or to refuse that right, as Paul did in this case. Does this passage tell us how much a missionary should receive in support? How much a pastor should receive? I really don't think so. You get into some interesting areas when it comes to things like bivocational ministry. Is there a case for Paul and his tent making? I happen to know some bivocational ministers. That's people who maybe work part-time in a church, maybe even full-time, but supplement their earnings through other kinds of jobs. There's risk in that, isn't there? With Paul, though he was a tent maker, we know from what we looked at in chapter 4 that Paul often went hungry. Paul often was homeless. So there was a lot of risk in this approach. Also, which is quite intriguing, if you look into 2 Corinthians, the Corinthians were embarrassed that Paul took this approach. They were saying, Paul, good for you to do that. This kind of makes us look bad. When we hear that, your apostle is out there on the streets having nowhere to sleep and is going hungry, it's a bad reflection on us. So Paul was aware of the risk. It would be like you phoning for a pastor and going, oh, can Pastor Smith come for a visit? And the secretary says, well, Pastor Smith is actually out in your neighborhood. Oh, really? Doing some ministry? Well, no. He sells vacuum cleaners door to door, and with any luck, he should be in your neighborhood in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Now, maybe that's okay, maybe that's good, but I think again it's one of those challenges in that. And then you get into the whole area of volunteers, and we could spend about an hour or two just talking about the implications. Should this work in the church be paid for? Should this be a volunteer assignment? And you guys know that maybe that's a gray area, right? Trying to sort that out and figure it out. But I want to just look quickly at a couple of implications. And one of them is that this notion of a willingness to forgo or to waive a right. So, for example, you might go to help somebody. If I went through Helping Hurting Family Fund here at the church, I'd receive a tax receipt. But I know some of you feel compelled to help someone, and you'd actually prefer not to get a tax receipt. You'd go, you know what? That's not what it's about. In fact, it'd spoil it for me if I had to go through 10 channels to do this. And I think that's very legitimate. Yesterday, I made a little donation to the Air Cadets over at Metro. Should have I stopped the young lady and said, can I get a receipt? No, I just did it because I felt compelled. I think it's a good cause, the Air Cadets, and so I offered a donation. You go into Morrow and I get Tim's for everyone in the office. Should you be saying to your supervisor, oh, is there an expense account for this? There might be, but there's sometimes we waive our rights just because we feel it's the right thing to do. You have a right to a day off, don't you? But if a friend or a family member calls and says, I really need help moving, many of you have been in that position, haven't you? Yes, you have the right to a day off, but out of love, you're going to help with a move with a friend or a family member. And then, as I said, where it hits hard is in the area of gray areas. You absolutely have a right to consume alcohol, but you may be in a situation, a circumstance, where you go, I will forego that right, I will waive that right for the good of that other person, given their situation, given their preferences, and given their circumstances in life. The last two passages I'm going to really just pick up on real quick. The one passage has to do with being a Jew to the Jew, a Greek to the Greek, someone who is weak to the weak. what we see here is that because Paul has made this choice in approach, he has what's called flexibility and accommodation. He's able to be quite adaptable. So we see in Paul saying, because I am free, not a slave, but I'm willing to be committed and to surrender to others if it promotes the gospel, if I can win them for Christ. Now, just a caution, this is what I would call limited flexibility, limited accommodation or adaptability. So if a friend calls you and says, can you come over tonight? I've got the Ouija board out. Would you like to participate with me? In that case, I'd likely refuse. I guess I've tipped my hat. I'm not sure that's a gray area. On the other hand, you may be in a position where a person is making a legitimate request. Paul said, I'm still able to participate in some Jewish rituals. Remember in Acts, we talked about the vows of the Nazarenes, and he was in a ceremony that was recognizing that. With the Greeks, we think of, remember Hudson Taylor, right? OMF, and we have a missionary couple, a family that we support through OMF, and Hudson Taylor became like a Chinese man. He dressed that way, he ate that way, all to make the gospel accessible and adaptable in different situations. Now, there's risk here. The risk is people are going to say, well, this kind of flexibility, the kind of flexibility that you go, well, in gray areas, you can be this way here, but you're going to be this way in another situation. Isn't that like a chameleon? Isn't that kind of a lack of integrity? Isn't that being inconsistent? Now, just to let you know, that accusation was hurled against Paul. Read through 2 Corinthians. That wonderful Paul, but you are so inconsistent. You're one way in this situation, another way in that situation. They weren't applauding. But I call it, this is my own label, sanctified inconsistency. Okay, consistency is one of my values. But that's the phrase I want to leave with you today. Sanctified inconsistency. There's some times where we go, I'm not the same way in every situation. Depending on what the situation calls for, I'm willing to be adaptable. So, when we were going to Africa a few years ago, I had packed up all kinds of nice shorts because I knew it was going to be really, really hot in Africa. My friend Doug Loveday, some of you know, phones me, says, John, I hope you didn't pack any shorts. I said, what do you mean? He said, because in Africa you got to wear long pants because it's only little boys in Africa who wear shorts. I said, you got to be kidding me. But hey, to win the Africans, to win the pastors over to a level of progress, hey, you got to be willing to adapt, willing to be flexible. When I preach up in Honey Harbor at the boat church, I'm expected to wear shorts. It would be out of place at the boat church not to be preaching without wearing shorts. So that doesn't sound good. You got to wear something, right? But shorts as opposed to long pants. In the same way, for some of you might say, if we're getting together with one family at Halloween time, they've got some strong convictions about going out for Halloween. They don't want to. It might say to your kids, hey, we might do something a little different tonight. Or if you're inviting somebody over on a Sunday afternoon, they may say, you know what, we really would prefer that our kids don't watch TV on a Sunday. And you may say to your children, hey, this is a chance for us to practice what we preach. And if it's a really important program, a sports event like the Leafs playing, my lesson, we just don't invite that kind of family over on a Sunday. Did I just say that out loud? Last thing is quick as our time is done. Verses 24 to 27, very simply, I do not believe that the strict training has to do with training yourself to behave this way. Strict training is like a metaphor. And what Paul is saying is it's the lesser to the greater. The lesser thing is relinquishing your rights. The greater thing is pursuing the great prize. And just like a marathon runner, a boxer is going into that strict training, which involves self-control. Often it involves abstaining from things that they have every right to drink or eat, but they are so determined to win that prize. So sometimes God's going to call us to relinquish our rights, to waive some rights in order to promote the gospel and out of love for one another. As I said last week, sometimes you wonder, well, how do I know it's the weaker brother, the weaker sister? You err on the side of grace and generosity. Always say, Lord, if somebody has to be put out, let me put myself out. And I know that you will honor me. The third part, the final part of this unit comes next week. And you have my permission to tell Pastor Josh, we are expecting a bang-up job on 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Will you stand with me for a great song to finish our service?